On the night of the 24th of December, 1945, on a hillside above Fayetteville, West Virginia, 5 children. It was Christmas Eve. The 9 Sodder children were home. 4 of them walked out in Benton. By sunrise, the house was a smoking pit, and no bones were found in the ash. 80 years on, the case is not, in the end, about a fire. It is about what a family does when they cannot bury their dead. 5 children, 1 fire, no bodies. This channel is called the Quiet Hill Dotchwood. This is the case of the Sodder children, and their names were Maurice Antonio, Martha Lee, Louis Errico, Jennie Irene, Betty Dolly. They were 14, 12, 9, 8, and 5 years old. They were the middle 5 of 10 Sodder children. George and Jennie Sodder were the parents, Italian immigrants, coal truck haulers, respected in Fayette County. By the morning of the 25th of December, were their 9 children home and walked out of the burning house. The other 5 were gone, so was every trace of them. George Sodder did not put up gravestones. He put up a billboard on Route 16, and he kept it there for 37 years. Chapter 1. The Sodders. George Sodder was born George Sodder in the village of Tula on the island of Sardinia in 1895. He stepped off a ship at Ellis Island in 1908. He was 13 years old. The older brother who had brought him over turned around almost at once and went home to Italy. The boy was left in New York on his own. He drifted through Pennsylvania. He carried water and tools to railroad gangs along the Pennsylvania Railroad. He worked his way south into the coal country of West Virginia. He settled in the town of Smithsonian. He hauled freight. He bought a truck. He bought another. By the early 1920s, he owned a small trucking and coal hauling company. Jennie Cipriani had been brought to America from Italy as a toddler. Her family ran a general store, Smithers, called the Music Box. George walked in one afternoon, saw the storekeeper's daughter, and that was the end of it. They married in 1922, though between 1923 and 1943 they had 10 children, all born and raised in the Appalachian foothills above Fayetteville. By the mid-1940s, George had a contract to haul coal out of the New River Gorge mines. He had 2 trucks parked in the yard. The family lived in a wooden 2-story farmhouse on a hillside, a few hundred yards off what is today State Route 16. Gardens, a chicken coop, a cow pasture. They did the town a couple of miles to the south. Fayetteville in 1945 was a small Appalachian town with a small but active Italian immigrant community. Drawn there by the coal industry, the Sodders were part of that community. They were also, by the end of the war, near the top of it. George was loud about politics. He was in particular loud about Benito Mussolini, whom he despised. He did not soften his opinion in the local Italian community, where Mussolini still had defenders deep into the war. That the detail will matter. Purchase chapter 2, the 5, on the night of the 24th of December 1945, 9 of the 10 Sodder children were home for Christmas. The 10th was the eldest son, serving in the U.S. Army overseas with the American occupation. Of the 9 children at home, 4 would walk out of the house alive. 5 would not be seen again. Each of the missing 5 is named on the death certificate the state of West Virginia issued on the 30th of December 1945. 6 days after the fire, the cause of death is listed as the fire. No body was ever produced for any of them. Maurice Antonio Sodder, 14 years old, named for his paternal grandfather. The middle of the missing 5, he had stayed up that night to help feed the cows and the chickens. Martha Lee Sodder, 12 years old, one of the 3 sisters who had been gifted new toys by Marion that evening and had asked to stay up later than usual. Louis Errico Sodder, 9 years old, the boy whose face would be on a billboard along Route 16 for the next 37 years, the boy whose grown-up photograph would, more than 2 decades later, arrive in the mail. Jennie Irene Sodder, 8 years old, named for her mother. Betty Dolly Sodder, 5 years old, the youngest. She had been asleep on the first floor when the children, excited about the new toys, persuaded their mother to let them stay up. The 4 siblings who survived the fire were Marion, John, George Jr., and Sylvia, who was 2 years old and whom Jennie carried out of the house. Sylvia would live until April 20, when she would carry the case for the rest of her life. Chapter 3. The events of that night are reconstructed mostly from interviews Jennie, George, Marion, and Sylvia gave in the years afterward and from the inquest record. Around 10 o'clock, Jennie went upstairs to bed carrying 2-year-old Sylvia. She left the 3 excited girls and the 2 younger boys downstairs with permission to stay up a little longer, on the condition that Maurice and Louis would put the George and the older boys, John and George Jr., who had worked alongside their father that day, were already in bed. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, the telephone in the downstairs hallway rang. Jennie came down and answered it. Though a woman's voice, stranger, with what Jennie later called a weird laugh, asked for a name Jennie did not recognize. Jennie told her it was the wrong number and hung up. Going back upstairs, she noticed 3 things, none of which alarmed her at the time. The front door was unlocked, the lights downstairs were still on, and Marion had fallen asleep on the couch. She went back to bed. Less than an hour later, she awoke, smelling smoke. Flames were moving along the bottom floor of the house. through the office George used, through the living room, toward the bedrooms. George woke. He shouted upstairs through the children. Marion on the couch woke and ran out. John and George Jr. got down the stairs and out. Jennie carried Sylvia out the door. George ran back to the side of the house to grab the ladder he always kept leaned against the wall. He was going to... No, you always gonna climb up to the second floor window. The ladder was not there. He ran for the two coal trucks parked in the yard. He had driven both that previous day. Both had started normally then. Neither would turn over now. He tried to scoop water from the rain barrel. The surface was frozen solid. From the lawn, the family could hear nothing from inside the house. The upstairs windows glowed orange. George cut his arm open, trying to break a window to get back in. He was driven back. Within 45 minutes, the house had collapsed in on itself. The fire moved fast, too fast by the family's later reckoning. The bottom floor was already fully alight by the time Jennie woke. None of the surviving family ever reported hearing any of the 5 younger children call out. From the lawn in the snow, half-dressed with a baby in her arms, Jennie watched the upstairs windows where her 5 children had been sleeping go orange, one at a time. Chapter 4. The morning Marianne ran to a neighbor's house and tried to call the Fayetteville volunteer fire department from there. The operator did not pick up. A second neighbor, watching the blaze from down the road, drove to a tavern and tried again. Again, no operator. He drove into town and physically found a fire chief, F.J. Morris. The Fayetteville volunteer department had no siren. Its alarm protocol was a phone tree. One firefighter called another, who called a third. By the time the truck arrived at the Sodder hillside, the sun was up. The house was a pit of ash. The fire department was 2.5 miles away. It had taken 7.5 to 8 hours to reach the scene. Chief Morris's official explanation for the absence of children's remains was that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the body. An inquest convened the next day, the 26th of December, ruled the fire accidental. The cause faulty wiring. 5 death certificates were issued on the 30th of December 1945. The Sodders did not accept this. The family pointed out repeatedly that the household appliances had survived the fire in recognizable form: the refrigerator, the stove, the bathtub, the sewing machine. So had the tin roof, found folded into the basement. Jennie would later experiment by burning small piles of animal bones in her stove to see whether intense fire could fully consume bone. She could never get one to vanish. The state had also, by its own electric utilities account, recently inspected and approved the wire. The Christmas tree lights downstairs, which were plugged in, had stayed lit for the first minutes of the fire. That was not consistent with wiring failure as the ignition source. The inquest itself was brief, convened her testimony, and ruled all within the space a few hours on the 26th of December. By the first week of 1946, the Sodder children case was as far as the state of West Virginia. Chapter 5, Witnesses and Sightings. Several things either witnessed or discovered in the days, weeks, and months after the fire shaped the family's belief that the children had not died in the house. These are claims, not findings. In October of 1945, a life insurance salesman called on George at the house. George refused to buy the policy. Before leaving, the man said that George's house was going up in smoke and his children would be destroyed, that he was going to be paid back for the dirty remarks he had been making about Newman. Around the same time, a different stranger came to the back of the house, ostensibly looking for hauling work. He walked over to the fuse boxes on the rear wall and said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." In the weeks before Christmas, the older Sodder boys noticed parked on the highway below the house, watching the younger children. The phone line, Jennie's first call attempt at night, failed. The phone line, which the family had assumed was burned in the fire, was later found to have been cleanly cut, well away from the burn area, at a point where a person had needed to climb a utility pole to reach. The ladder George had reached for, missing from its usual place, was found the next day at the bottom of an embankment, roughly 75 feet from the house. The trucks, neither would start that morning. Both had been driven the previous day. Mechanical examination afterward. The bus driver, the driver of a bus that passed below the house, late on Christmas Eve, told investigators he had seen figures throwing. The sighting was dismissed at the time. Months later, after the snow had melted from the property, 2-year-old Sylvia, playing in the yard, found a hard, dark green rubber object, hollow, with a screw-off cap. George identified it with help from army contacts as a pineapple bomb, a napalm incendiary device. Jennie said she remembered hearing a heavy thud on the roof that night and the sound of something rolling. A neighbor reported seeing a local man hauling a block and tackle rig away from the burned property the days after the fire. A tool of the sort used to lift an engine out of a vehicle. A woman watching the blaze from the road said she saw what she believed were Sodder children peering out the back window of a car that drove past the burning house. A woman working at a rest stop on the road between Fayetteville and Charleston said she served breakfast the following morning to a group of children who matched the descriptions of the missing 5 in the company of adults. She noted a car with Florida plates in the lot. And in 1953, a woman named Ida Crutchfield, who ran a small hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, came forward after seeing the children's faces in a newspaper. She said that about a week after the fire, 4 children matching the missing Sodders had been brought into her hotel after midnight. They had been brought in by 2 men and 2 women who appeared, as she described, of Italian extraction. She tried to speak with the children. One of the men turned and began speaking rapidly in Italian, and the whole party fell silent. The group left before dawn. Down in Chapter 6, the excavation. In December of 1945, the family had asked Chief Maurice to search the basement carefully. He told them that the 4 to 6 inches of ash at the bottom of the pit had been searched, and only a few suspected bone fragments had been found, which were lost. The family did not consider this adequate. In August of 1949, almost 4 years after the fire, George Sodder convinced Oscar B. Hunter Jr., a pathologist in Washington, D.C., to oversee a careful excavation of the ash and not New York, not a firm. A D.C. pathologist with the analysis later carried out at the Smithsonian institution. The Hunter team sifted the basement floor. They found a dictionary that had belonged to the children. They found coins. They found small pieces of household debris. They also found 4 small bone fragments. The fragments were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where they were examined by Newman's report, dated 1949, concluded the following: that all 4 fragments were human lumbar vertebrae from the same individual. The transverse processes were fused, indicating an age at death at least 16 or 17. The vertebral centra were not yet fused, putting the upper bound about 22. The vertebrae showed no evidence of exposure to fire. It was therefore very unlikely the bones had come from any of the 5 missing Sodder children, the oldest of whom, Maurice. The Smithsonian's recommendation was that the bones most likely came from the dirt George had used to fill in the basement floor for the memorial garden, dirt that had been hauled from somewhere else. The bone fragments were returned to George in September of 1949. Their present location is not known. In the careful sift of a basement where 5 children were said to have burned, the Hunter excavation produced 4 vertebrae from a person who was probably not Sodder, and in 1952, the family put up a billboard at the site of the former house along what is today State Route 16, with photographs of the 5 missing children and their ages and in question. A second billboard went up along U.S. Route 16 near Instead. Chapter 7, the search in 1947, George wrote to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, asking the Bureau to take the case. J. Edgar Hoover replied personally. The matter, he wrote, appeared to be of local character and did not come within the investigative jurisdiction of the Bureau. The FBI offered to assist if the Fayetteville police and fire departments invited them in. Fayetteville declined. In 1950, after the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case, the governor and the state police superintendent told the family that the case was hopeless. The Sodders did not stop. C.C. Tinsley, the private investigator the family hired out of Goldy Bridge, discovered something about the life insurance salesman who had threatened George and the same man had subsequently sat on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. Tinsley also identified a local man, Lonnie Johnson, who admitted to having cut the Sodders telephone line about 30 minutes before the fire began. Tinsley could not, however, tie Johnson to the salesman in any probable way. No charges were ever filed. George traveled. He went anywhere a lead pointed. He drove through Manhattan after seeing a newspaper photograph of school children that he believed included his daughter Betty. The family refused to speak with him. He drove to St. Louis. He drove to Houston. He drove to Florida. He hired investigators. He paid for advertisements in newspapers across half the country. He printed flyers by the tens of thousands and pinned them up at gas stations and diners on the bulletin boards of small-town libraries from Charleston to the Gulf. He offered a reward, first $5,000, then $10,000 for any information that would settle the case, or even he kept files, he kept envelopes of correspondence, he kept the names and dates of every tip the family received. He kept the Hoover letter, he kept the Smithsonian report, he kept the photographs the family had of the 5 children before the fire. School portraits, a holiday picture, the kind of small everyday pictures that after Christmas Eve became the only images that would ever exist of them. The Sodders believed and continue to believe that some part of the local Italian community, possibly with organized crime, ties out of the larger Eastern Seaboard networks, was behind the fire and the disappearance. That was the family's theory. It was tied to the threats George had received and to his outspoken anti-Mussolini politics in a community where Mussolini still had defenders. It was never corroborated, it was never proven. It is presented here only because the Sodders themselves believed it. George Sodder died in 1969, having found none of his children, having buried none of them, having stopped looking for none of them. Jennie outlived him by 20 years. She wore black every day until her death in 1980. She tended the dirt-filled basement of the burned house as a memorial garden for the rest of her life. Chapter 8. The photograph. In 1967, or by some accounts, 1968, Jennie went out to the mailbox and found an envelope addressed only to her. There was no return address. The postmark was Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man in his mid-20s, dark hair, the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth. The family looked at the picture and saw the face of Louis as he might have looked grown up. They had last seen Louis at 9 years old. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note. The wording recorded by family and by reporters reads, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, you little boys, and 9/032 or 35. No one in the family knew what the second and third lines meant. No one was sure whether Frankie was a name or a code. No one knew whose handwriting it was. The Sodders hired a private investigator and sent him to Central City. The trip produced nothing the family ever spoke of publicly. By some accounts, the investigator returned empty-handed. By other accounts, he stopped communicating, and the family found him again. The sender of the photograph never made contact a second time. No further envelope arrived. The family did not publish the photograph or the postmark town at first, fearing that whoever had sent it, and whoever the man in it might be, would be put in danger. They commissioned a larger version of the photograph, framed it, and hung it over the fireplace at George and Jennie's new house. They also updated the billboard on Route 16 to include the photograph of the grown man with the caption, "Loose." In a newspaper interview given near the end of his life, George Sodder said, "Time is running out for us, but we don't want to know. If they die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know." George died not long after, and it is still known. The photograph is still in the possession of the family. Chapter 9. After Jennie kept the billboard up. She kept the photograph over the fireplace. She tended the memorial garden in the basement. She wore black every day until her death on the 21st of January 1989. The billboard on Route 16 came down shortly after. It had stood at the foot of the hillside for 37 years. Local children knew the faces. Travelers passing through southern West Virginia knew the question. The basement of the original house, filled in with dirt and planted as a memorial garden by George and Jennie, is gone. The family later built a new house nearby. The hillside, the Sodder house, stood on remains in family hands. The eldest son returned from the army to a family that had been broken in his absence. He lived out his life and died decades later, leaving descendants. The 4 siblings who escaped that night, Marion, John, George Jr., Sylvia, are all gone now. The last of them, Sylvia, died on the 21st of April 2021 at 79. In 2013, the Charleston Gazette-Mail published a long retrospective on the case by A.D. Hopkins, drawing on interviews with Sylvia Sodder Paxton in her early 70s and with one of George's. Sylvia's daughter has continued to give interviews into the 2020s. The federal file the FBI briefly opened in the early 1950s was closed without resolution. The Charlie Project lists all 5 missing children's active missing persons cases. 80 years after Christmas Eve 1945, the case is still open. The 5 death certificates issued on the 30th of December 1945 were never amended. None of the 5 children were ever found alive. Coda, what a family does when they cannot bury their dead. George Sodder kept a billboard up for the rest of his life. He put no gravestones in the family plot. He never bought a stone for Maurice, or for Martha, or for Louis, or for Jennie Irene, or for Betty. He filled in the basement of the house that had burned. He made a garden out of it, and he kept it. He told a reporter in the last year of his life, "We only want to know." The case in the end is not the fire case. The fire is documented, the house burned. That part of the record is not in dispute. What the record could not produce, what every investigation since has not produced, is a body, any body. 5 children went into a house on Christmas Eve 1945. The house came down. The dirt was sifted. Nothing was found. George spent 24 years after that night looking. Jennie spent 44 years wearing black. Sylvia spent 76 years carrying the question her mother had handed her on the lawn in the snow. The mystery the case outlives is not the fire. The mystery is what a family does when they cannot bury their dead. Maurice Antonio, Martha Lee, Louis Errico, Jennie Irene, Betty Dolly, and the question that stayed on a board for 37 years. This channel is called the Quiet Hill Dolly. We come back to the things people did and the silences that grew around them. Subscribe and the next one will find you. Until then, keep them in mind. 5 children, 1 fire, and the question their father kept by the road for 37 years.